have a talk by Dora. So we are so glad to have one of her own share one of her passions with us today.
Thank you. I'm a former kindergarten teacher. When kindergartners had sat that long, they got squirrely and antsy. And feel free anytime to stand up, turn around, move, shake your arms, do something.
Some of us cannot see that screen if you stand there, so you need to fall just a little bit.
Okay, I'm going to move out of the way. Actually, okay. I became friends through the internet with the author of Viola Liuzzo's biography, Mary Stanton. Mary Stanton. I became friends with her through the internet. I had not met Mary personally, but I had been to a presentation where she got an award for this book. It was nominated for the Pulitzer Prize. I didn't know that at the time, but I found out later. And the movie made from the book that came out in 2004 was nominated for an Academy Award. Actually, the director was an Academy Award-winning documentarian. So, Russ, just go ahead. This was a picture of her at age 24. Go back. Well, you can't go back, never mind. This is the one they used of her. It was her 24-year-old picture. It's kind of like your senior year in school. She did not look like that at the time. I'm going to be talking about all this, but I want you to see the pictures and just kind of hold them in your memory. These are marchers resting along the Jefferson Davis Highway, the Selma Voting Rights March that Viola was part of. Go ahead. You can see there are people from all kinds. And then we enter the Capital City Cleanse welcomes you. How would you like to be driving into a town where the Klan welcomes you? Go ahead, Russ. This is Montgomery city limits. This is her bullet-ridden Oldsmobile that she drove down from Detroit and Big Swamp, Alabama. She was shot and killed and veered off the road through a fence and landed there. That's her. This is a very emotional story, so I should have passed out tissues because this is very upsetting and disturbing. Go ahead, Ray. This young man was the passenger in Viola Liuzzo's car when she was murdered. His life was changed beyond reason. He was on television, he was questioned, he was held responsible for her murder. They accused him, if you had not been with her, she would not have been killed. You know, you knew better. You know the situation. She was driving the car, he was sitting in the front seat with her. That's all. No, that's the same picture. Just there it is. This is her daughter's Penny's first communion. Go ahead, Russ. These are just family portraits that Mary Stanton. Well, we know who that guy is. He just might as well have pulled the trigger himself. He killed her, hands down. Go ahead. I have very lot of disdain. Okay. This is Robert M. Shelton, Imperial Wizard of the United Klans of America. The defense attorney and Matthew Hobson Murphy, the defense attorney. That William Rowe, that was the attorney for Wilkins, Rowe, Eaton, and Thomas. Now those were all the men in the car when Rowe actually pulled the trigger. He was the undercover FBI informant. That's why I said Hoover could have just shot her himself. Go ahead, Ray.
So they were coming back from a march, back to the airport or something.
Yeah, I'll tell you all about that. This is her home in Detroit. She lived in an upper middle class home. I mean, for the time, her husband had a great job. She did not have to work. She worked in the early years of their marriage, but I couldn't say enough about her husband, although there's not a lot written about him. But he reminds me of Russ. Anything Viola wanted to do, he was right there saying, sure, go on, do it, great. Go ahead. This is one of her daughters after the United States government just ruled that they weren't responsible for the death of her mother. How would you like to have been in her place that day? This was 1983. This family suffered through 2 decades of trying to get justice and still didn't. Go ahead. This is Tony Liuzzo. I think he's her oldest son, in 1982. I'll tell you more about him in my talk. He's Tony Jr. Now this was near the age where she was murdered. This is how she looked. She just looked ordinary, just like most women do today. Well, she wore makeup, she dressed up, she was pretty. This was the Requiem Mass held for her. Her husband was Catholic, so I'm sure that's why he had the funeral there. Viola was Unitarian Universalist. This is a memorial along the highway. Actually, it's in the spot where she was right off the highway from where she was murdered. There it is in its original state. It had been defaced 3 times. Okay, see the one defacing? The women from the SCLC decided they were just going to leave that Confederate flag painted on it as a reminder that hatred had not been extinguished. And that's it. Thank you, Russ. Viola Liuzzo was one of the earliest feminists that you'll never read about, and you'll never see her name written, you'll never see her picture, and you'll never hear her spoken about. During the 1970s, as the feminist movement grew stronger and stronger and more organized, she was one very early feminist. When the teacher turned astronaut, Krista McAuliffe, was killed in the Challenger explosion in 1986, rumblings began about a mother's right to leave her children to undertake a dangerous mission. That criticism was mild compared to the hatred that was showed toward Viola Liuzzo. Viola was villainized over and over and over again for leaving her 5 children. But by all accounts, she was an extraordinary woman. She would no doubt have been involved right here in this fellowship very much. She would have been organizing social justice programs. She would have definitely have had her signs already made, ready to use in Trump's protest rally tomorrow in Louisville. She would. But first of all, I'd like to give you some background on her early life. you have to know where she came from to know the person she grew into. She was born into a small town, California, Pennsylvania, April 11th, 1925. Her mother was a teacher. Her father worked in the coal mines, and he was a World War I veteran. Her father had left school in the 8th grade, but taught himself to read. Her mother had a teaching certificate from the University of Pittsburgh. And the couple just had one other daughter, Rosemary, in 1930. While on the job, her father's right hand was blown off in a mine explosion, and during the Great Depression, the family had become solely dependent on her mother's income. Work was very hard to come by for the family, and Mrs. Gregg could only pick up temporary part-time teaching positions. As the family descended deeper and deeper into poverty, they decided to move from Georgia to Chattanooga, Tennessee, where her mother found a teaching position. Viola was 6. It's like jumping from the frying pan into the fire. The family was very poor. They were living in one-room shacks with no water. The schools Viola attended did not have adequate supplies, and the teachers were too busy to give extra attention to children in need. And because the family moved so often, Viola never began and ended the same school year in the same place. Having spent much of her childhood and adolescence poor in Tennessee, she experienced the segregated nature of the South firsthand. This would eventually have a powerful impact on her activism. It was during her formative years that she realized the unjustness of segregation and racism. As she and her family, no matter how poor they were, but because of the color of their skin, they were still afforded the social privileges and the amenities that were denied to African Americans under the Jim Crow laws. In 1941, her family moved to Ypsilanti, Michigan, where her father found a job assembling bombs in the Ford Motor Company. Viola was a strong-willed teenager. I figured she was probably very sexually liberated even then, because she just dropped out of high school. Of course, and she was really, really bright too. A lot of high school students don't see the relevance of high school. She was one of them. She dropped out of school, eloped at the age of 16. Marriage lasted, some accounts say it lasted a day. She just probably wanted to get out of the situation of school and her family. But 2 years later, they moved to Detroit. That was a real frying pan. One of the most segregated northern cities. Tension began between whites and blacks in Detroit was at an all-time high, and in the early 40s, violence and rioting was rampant. Witnessing these horrific acts was another major motivator that influenced her future civil rights work. And in 1943, she married a man, another person, that she worked for. He was a restaurant manager. They had 2 children, Penny and Mary. Now, Mary is the one that I would say has become the most successful of her children. I'll tell you more about her later. But they were divorced in '49. She later married Anthony Liuzzo, a Teamsters Union business agent. They had 3 children, Tommy, Anthony Jr., and Sally. Showing her true feminist beliefs, Viola resisted her oppression as a woman as well. When she went back to school as a high school dropout, a working class housewife, and a mother of 5, she wrote these words: "I protest the attitude of the great majority of men who hold to the conviction that any married woman who is able to find contentment and self-satisfaction when confined to homemaking displays a lack of emotional health." And this is what men thought at the time. Well, her thoughts could have well been a page right out of Betty Friedan's Feminine Mystique, because that's what Betty Friedan wrote. Well, she went on to get a degree from the Carnegie Institute, and she was trained as a medical laboratory assistant, so she's smart, really smart. And then she enrolled part-time at Wayne State University in 1963. And I think she did this just because she wanted to explore more, and she wanted to learn more. A large part of her activism was, I'd say, attributed to, in 1964, she attended the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Detroit, where many of the members there in that congregation had been freedom riders in the earlier struggle against segregation in public transportation. So during this time, she became active in the NAACP. And a part of her activism, particularly with the NAACP, was due to a close friend of hers, who was an African-American woman named Sarah Evans. Now, back in these times, white women didn't talk to black women. That wasn't, if you did, if you were friends, you did it kind of in the shadows. But after meeting Sarah, they developed a very close friendship, and they stayed close until Viola left to go to Selma. And in fact, Sarah Evans became the permanent caretaker of her children. Viola was so passionately believed in the fight for human rights, she helped organize Detroit's protest. She attended civil rights conferences, she worked with the NAACP, she had a strong desire to make a difference on a large scale. She indeed answered Dr. King's command. Life's most persistent and urgent question is, what are you doing for others? In addition to actively supporting the civil rights movement, she was known for her protest against the Detroit laws that allowed for students to drop out of school in like 15 or 16. Well, now Viola disagreed with this law to the point, and you can see where she's coming from. If she's thinking back, if I had stayed in school, I wouldn't have probably run off, and I wouldn't have had that, I wouldn't have made all the mistakes I made. So she didn't want this to happen to other kids. She was thinking down the road of other people's children. And she decided she was going to take a stand. So she just withdrew her children from school. She homeschooled them for 2 months. Well, authorities come after you if you don't send your children to school. And she was arrested. She didn't waver. She didn't say, well, I did this because of my beliefs. She pleaded guilty in court. She had a record. And she is placed on probation. In February of 1965, Viola was watching television and she saw the night demonstration for voting rights at the Marion, Alabama courthouse. She saw it turn violent. State troopers clubbed marchers and beat and shot a 26-year-old African-American named Jimmy Lee Jackson, who later died. His death spurred the fight for civil rights in Selma, Alabama. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, scheduled a protest march on Sunday, March the 7th, 1965. Governor Wallace banned the march, but the ban was ignored. 600 marchers headed for the arched William Pettus Bridge that crossed the Alabama River. And as the protesters reached the crest of the bridge, you've seen the films, you've seen the videos, they saw a terrifying sight on the other end. State troopers armed with clubs, whips, tear gas, and a sheriff's posse on horseback. When told to stop and disperse, the marchers refused. The troopers advanced on the marchers, clubbing, whipping, beating, fracturing bones, gashing heads. 17 people were hospitalized on that day. It was later to be called Bloody Sunday. It was on this day that the U.S. Representative John Lewis, we all know John, was brutally attacked and nearly killed. Viola watched these images and was horrified at the aborted march on this Sunday, Bloody Sunday. A second march took place March the 9th, where troopers and police and marchers confronted each other again on the county end of the bridge, but when the troopers stepped aside to let them pass, Dr. King led the protesters back to the church. He was obeying a federal injunction while seeking protection from the federal court for the march. That night, a white group beat and murdered civil rights activist James Reeb, a Unitarian Universalist minister from Boston. If you've ever read about him, he was coming out of a restaurant and was trying to find his way back to a church where they were going to have a meeting later. And he just got lost. He and the guy that was with him, they made a wrong turn, and they ended up in a very violent area of Selma, and he was killed. He was beaten to death. He was a Unitarian Universalist minister from Boston who had come to march with the second group. There were so many clergies and sympathizers from all across the country. They also gathered there too. On March the 16th, Viola took part in a protest at Wayne State. Then she called her husband to tell him she'd be traveling to Selma after hearing Reverend King talk about people of all faiths that need to come together and work for this struggle. It was everyone's fight, he said. So leaving her children in the care of family and Sarah, she contacted the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, told them she was coming. They took her on. They tasked her with delivering aid to various locations. They gave her jobs. She was one that welcomed. She recruited volunteers. She transported people from place to place in her old, well, it wasn't old then, her 1963 Oldsmobile. On March the 21st, 1965, this is kind of day after tomorrow is March 21st. 3,000 people began a third march, and these people included people from all races, doctors, nurses, working class people, priests, nuns, rabbis, homemakers, that's an old-fashioned term, students, actors, farmers. Many famous people participated, including Dr. King, Ralph Bunche, Coretta Scott King, Robert Abernathy, Andrew Young. It took 5 days for the protesters to reach their goal. And Viola marched the first full day and returned to Selma for the night. On Wednesday, March 24th, she rejoined the march 4 miles from the end, where the Night of Stars celebration was being held at the city of St. Jude. Now you can imagine what this would have been like. Harry Belafonte, Sammy Davis Jr., Joan Baez, and Dick Gregory all participated. Viola helped at the first aid station, and on that Thursday, the other marchers reached the state capitol building in Montgomery with a Confederate flag flying proudly above it, while Dr. King addressed the crowd of 25,000 people, calling the march a shining moment in American history. After the third march concluded on March the 25th, I'm going to call her Viola, her name throws me. Viola, assisted by Leroy Moten, you saw him on the screen, a 19-year-old African-American man, they continued shuttling marchers and volunteers from Montgomery back to Selma in her car. As they were driving along Route 80, a car tried to force them off the road. After dropping passengers off in Selma, she and Moten headed back to Montgomery. As they were getting gas at a local filling station, they were called names, racist names. When Viola stopped at a red light, though, a car with 4 white men pulled up alongside her. Now, those were the ones that you saw in the picture there. They were the members of the local KKK. When they saw a white woman and a black man in a car together, they followed Viola as she tried to outrun them. Now, some sources say, why did she do that? She could have pulled over at the first federal marshal she saw. She could have pulled into the Air Force base there that was close by, and she didn't. And some people said that she didn't trust any authorities, none. That's the reason she didn't. She just kept on driving like a wild woman, and she was wild. She was high strung, and she was probably pissed off, and she just floored it. But we know what happened. They pulled alongside her, shot twice into the car, hitting her in the head, both bullets. And the car veered into a ditch and crashed into a fence. Although Leroy Moulton was covered in Viola's blood, the bullets had missed him. I'm sure I think they shot more than twice, but you never know. I mean, those two hit her. He just lay down motionless in the car and didn't move because he knew the Klansmen would come back, and they did. They came back to check on him. So they were convinced both of them were dead. Leroy, when it was clear, began searching for help, and he eventually flagged down a truck driven by Reverend Leroy Riley. Reverend Riley was like Leroy and Viola. He was shuttling civil rights marchers back and forth to Selma. Her funeral was held, you saw the picture, at the Immaculate Heart of Mary Catholic Church in Detroit on March the 30th, with many prominent members of both the civil rights movement and the government there. Dr. King attended, the NAACP Director Roy Wilkins was there, the Congress on Racial Equality, the national leader James Farmer was there, the Michigan Lieutenant Governor William G. Wilkin was there, Teamsters President Jimmy Hoffa, and United Auto Workers President Walter Reuther. They were all there, and she was buried at Holy Sepulchre Cemetery in Southfield, Michigan. Less than 2 weeks after her death, a charred cross was found in front of 4 Detroit family homes. One of them was hers. Her daughter, Mary, says, "We didn't know my mother as a civil rights activist. Her response to the movement just flowed naturally from how she felt about everything. She loved nature, she loved children, adventure, other people. It was all one big piece to her. She questioned and challenged everything." Mary Liuzzo told author Mary Stanton, "Viola was fascinated with the dialogues of the ancient Greek philosopher Plato, and she read books to us by American philosopher Henry David Thoreau. Viola's house was full of books, full of bookshelves, crammed with books." Daughter Penny told Mary, "Well, she had a million interests, that's for sure." Remember, Mary is the writer of her biography. "She used to take me and my sisters to the symphony and to the art museum downtown, and we'd go rock collecting and camping with my brothers. She even let me sit in on some of her college classes once in a while. She was always telling us what she was studying. She was talking about what was going on in the world and in the next sections. And in the next second, she'd be out there rescuing stray animals off the road. Or she'd be feeding the bums and giving them spending money." I want to go back. I want to take you back a little bit. I want to sort of make a circle, because this information came from her family. According to her family, the events of Bloody Sunday was what convinced Viola to join the Selma to Montgomery March 2 weeks later. The day after the attack on the bridge, and civil rights leader Dr. King sent out an appeal across the country for all those who supported the African American freedom movement to come to Selma. That's when she decided. A week later, after attending a rally, see, I'm looping you back, at Wayne State, in sympathy with the voting rights marchers, she called her husband and she told him, "There were too many people just standing around talking. and that she was going to Alabama for a week. She asked her best friend Sarah to explain her absence to the children. Sarah Evans reportedly warned Viola, "You're going to be killed, you're going to be killed." And she replied, "I want to be a part of it." She was so full of hope and so conscious that the future would include more than just her story. According to Sarah Evans, Viola would often say, "Sarah, you and I are going to change the world. One day they'll write about us." You'll see. Well, they did. Shortly after Viola's assassination, the media just descended, you can imagine, on her husband and 5 children. 14-year-old Tommy told reporters she wanted equal rights for everyone, no matter what the cost. And according to Liuzzo's daughter, Mary, she said, "My mother was raised in the South and she followed the whole labor story. She noted that the FBI had files from the investigation of Viola's death showing letters Viola had written to protest the government's witch hunt of the labor unions." See, they had that little bit on her already. You better believe they used it against her, didn't they? In an interview, Sarah Evans later said of her friend, "Viola lived a life that combined the care of her family and her home with a concern for the world around her. This involvement with her at times was not always understood by her friends, nor was it appreciated by those around her." So after Viola's death, here comes the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover to begin a smear campaign against her beyond anything you could imagine. She was red-baited, meaning she was thought to be a communist sympathizer. She was accused of sexual immorality, in particular with African American men. Stories that she was sexually involved with numerous men spread. She had abandoned her husband and her children, and she had a drug problem. She had been institutionalized for emotional problems, and that her husband had mob connections. Viola was soon to be vilified by the entire nation. Her house in Detroit, the people stopped, threw garbage at her house, in her yard. Her youngest daughter was even stoned on her way to school. The Liuzzo family discovered that the campaign to discredit their mother had been instigated by you-know-who, J. Edgar Hoover. The FBI spread rumors that Viola was a drug addict, that her husband was an organized crime member, and that she definitely had a relationship with Leroy Moulton. For decades, Hoover's FBI infiltrated and disrupted left-wing and protest movements. According to Coretta Scott King, whose husband, Martin Luther King Jr., was relentlessly hounded by Hoover, Coretta wrote, "The FBI treated the civil rights movement as if it were an alien enemy attack on the United States." The FBI informant, Gary Rowe, who actually shot Viola, was in the car of the night of the Klan members killing her. The 3 Klansmen were acquitted by the state, but later they served a 10-year federal sentence for the violation of her civil rights. Rowe was never charged with any crime and was put in the Federal Witness Protection Program. Viola was the only white woman to give her life during this black civil rights movement of the 1960s. With that sacrifice, she just joined a handful of white men like Reverend James Reed. One image of Viola comes to your mind. I've seen this picture, a portrait of her in line. She's carrying her shoes, and she's walking the last few miles to Montgomery, and she's looking straight ahead, focused completely on her goal. after the assassination, J. Edgar Hoover attempted to deflect focus away, because everybody was saying the FBI did it. So he was trying everything he could to deflect the focus away from the agency. And this smear campaign he launched against her took an immense toll on her family. It took them over 2 decades to uncover the truth. 2 decades. Her children filed a lawsuit in 1979 against the U.S. government seeking damages for their mother's murder. In 1983, a civil right ended in the dismissal of the family's claims. You might be wondering, well, what on earth happened to her family? Well, you can imagine. Things didn't go good. When Jim, her husband, his health deteriorated, and he died in 1978. And he was just about penniless. There was not enough money for him to be buried in the same cemetery as his wife. The oldest son, Tommy, was committed to a Michigan State mental hospital in 1980, and after his release disappeared into the Alabama hills near where his mother was murdered. Son Tony eventually became second in command of the Michigan militia and went underground after September 11th, 2001. They were the angriest of all her children, and they acted out on that anger. Her daughters, Mary, Penny, and Sally, all went on to become successful business people or executives and settled on the West Coast. Mary Stanton told me that she remains friends with Viola's daughter Mary now. And the documentary I told you about earlier was called Home of the Brave. You can Google it, but you have to Google Home of the Brave documentary, because there's another Home of the Brave movie. It came out in 2004, and Mary Stanton, the author, and Viola's children are all interviewed in this film. In 1996, the U.S. Congress designated the Selma to Montgomery as a National Historic Trail along Highway 80. It included a historical center and markers for the 12 sites along the way. Viola's memorial marker, you saw it, sits right in the middle of the trail. Representative John Lewis was the person that proposed the designation of the trail. He said, this is where people suffered, this is where people bled, and this is where a woman gave her life in the cause of the right to vote. And her marker was left, as you saw it. The SCLC decided not to remove the paint because they said they wanted to leave it as a reminder that the struggle for racial equality isn't over. This is exactly the way Mary ended her book. The struggle continues still today. But she had these final words to say about Viola. She said she possessed deep sensibilities, a short temper, abiding warmth, painful restlessness, and a strong moral compass. Once upon a time, she did something extraordinary for civil rights and for social justice. And if anybody has any questions, I'll be glad to answer them. Thank you.